connections?
it.
No, it's not.
I think you have to go to zoom.us and change your settings there.
Oh, it's not just in the settings. Oh, darn.
How are the boys doing?
Doing fine.
Oh, good. Good.
Oh, wait a
I
minute.
am-
Activate emoji hand. No, it says I could activate following emojis based on hand
Oh.
gestures.
Chatting back and forth with Paul Allison today.
Oh,
I
to
see you're
Oh.
making
features
your
on Wednesday, so that'll be another blast from the past.
sorry.
Nope.
Trying to get it
Sorry,
going.
Jen.
It's
No
not
luck.
working. Jeff, why does yours work?
What about
Let's see. Is Dave's? Yeah, Dave's is working too.
thanks, John.
Talk to Diane. So, John, I didn't get any questions together. Do you have some questions for Dave today?
No.
Hmm.
We'll just let him talk and then we'll come up with some questions as we go along.
I finished
We
developing
could-
my first public AI presentation today. I'm doing professional development for the local business community, and it's weird. I caught the tail end of what you were saying, Jen.
Mm-hmm.
It's a strange line to try to walk.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
So in the business community, so they talking, well, we can save some of this. Sounds like impact of technology on social interactions, and what other questions, what other headings do I have here? Where can I stick this? Online community dynamics. No, I don't know. Jeff looks serious.
I'm just
Yeah.
making sure the stream is active and
For how many listeners do we have?
hey, when that one person finally stops by, we're going to be glad that things are in. And we've tweeted to our thousands of bots.
Yeah, I was talking to my friend today, and I was telling her what we've been doing, and she's like, "Oh, how do I catch this? She didn't call it a stream, the webinar or whatever." No, it's really not a webinar.
All right, are we ready? Oh, I got to start recording. What was that, Dave?
I was trying to catch it.
Catch
Oh.
the webinar.
Do you ever read our AI summations?
I do not.
They're pretty amusing. If you go to edtechtalk.com, you'll see the AI summaries.
How close is it?
Dave and Jeff had a lively discussion about solar panels.
Oh, really?
Hello and welcome to EdTech Talks, ongoing discussion of Dave Cormier's Learning in a Time of Abundance. This week, 2 chapters. Chapter 5, Societal Implications. Chapter 6, Learning to Confront Uncertainty. That's right, double episode, no extra charge. Tonight we'll be covering classroom problems versus wicked hard real-life problems. We'll be asking, is Dave's post-boredom world of abundance the reason we can't have nice things? Along the way, we might cover gnome carving and something about how Dave and John met on a dating app. So stay tuned. I am Jeff Lebo in Busan, Korea.
My name is Jennifer Madrill in Chicago, Illinois.
This is John Schinker in Stowe, Ohio.
And I'm Dave Cormier in Windsor, Ontario, Canada.
Well, that was a lovely introduction, Jeff. Did you have any more you'd like to kick us off with?
And
with
the people who are
questions?
viewing on YouTube can see an actual gnome that Dave has apparently carved.
Oh.
And we'll save the dating app story for the post show. But Jen is extra prepared tonight, not only in quantity, but in speed. She was ready like hours before the show.
I think it was at least 2 hours before versus 7 minutes before. That would probably even be lying for the prior ones. But yeah, we have 2 chapters. We may as well just get right into it, right? We've got 57 minutes now. So this one picks up on some of the themes you've talked about in other chapters in terms of abundance of information and impact. But this time it's, as Jeff mentioned, the chapter 5 is on the societal implications. Let's just kind of jump right into it. So one of the things just kind of kick off the chapter talking about are the shifts in our shared experiences now that we are living in this time of, and I think it's kind of also technology abundance, right? We all have a cell phone at our hand at any moment, and how that has shifted our relationships from and interactions from the days of old face-to-face interactions. So to me, that's kind of a good place to start the conversation. So, why did you pick this as a thing to talk about, pivoting from what we were talking about in prior chapters with specifically with the implications of abundance of information, and we're kind of talking about it from learning and an education perspective. This seems to kind of broaden the conversation to societal implications.
So like I said last time, a lot of these chapters got sweepy swapped throughout the process. I think the reason why I ended up putting this here was what I was trying to do was build a story that you could follow along with. And sort of at this part, I'm trying to turn from the way that we've learned to how it impacts us in the real world. Because ostensibly, the book is about how we learn in the real world, not how we learn in school, and also how the way we have learned in school affects the way that we learn in the real world. It's funny, I was talking to somebody today about writing in the professional world in an AI world, and how so much of what you need to do is work after the fact rather than work before the fact. So just that difference in like trying to talk to people about telling your boss that you're going to need an extra 2 hours after you have the product to make sure it's unbiased it's a whole different way of thinking about learning, producing, and all the rest of that stuff. And that those changes, I think, are the ones we need to process. And we need to process that from a work perspective, but also from a personal perspective. And I think the example in that 5th chapter is around sleepovers, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the one that sort of really drives it home for me, is just watching that transition and seeing how the technology affects the everyday. I think there's great value in the lead up to a thing where you're sort of thinking your way through what's going to happen. So like I talked to my kid, especially my eldest, about what they're going to say when they go into the doctor's office to ask a question. And if you're on your phone in the car all the way to the doctor's office, and then you're checking your phone once you walk into the doctor's office, that preparatory time that's built in, that boredom time, that downtime where you're just stuck in the car, isn't there for you to pre-process the things you're going to do. So that first moment of connection doesn't have the same, and again, not everybody all the time, obviously, but all of those kinds of little pieces, I think, are the ones that really have the biggest impact on us culturally in the way that we interact.
One thing I appreciated about the chapter, at least this is my take, and maybe this was not your intention, I didn't think you took necessarily a stand it's better or worse. I think it's, a lot of it's different.
Yep.
And certainly as we go through my questions, we would not all be here having this prolonged friendship. And that's another thing we can talk about too, friendships online when we get into that too. But we certainly would not probably have the opportunity to meet with Jeff very often. And then even all of us here in North America, it would be difficult. So I certainly think we could make an argument that there's a lot of advantage to the better part of the equation. But I'm just kind of curious for the others on the call, kind of loop you in. So what are your kind of takeaways on the better or worse of face-to-face versus online? And John, actually, maybe you could talk about how you met your wife, because this does go back away.
How I met my wife.
Yeah.
I did meet my wife online in 1990 when she sent me an email, which it was just a different world, and yet very much similar to what we see now. It's many of my best friends are people that I've met online, and some of those are people that I went, and 3 of them are on this call, people that I knew for years before we met face to face. And I'm pretty sure that there have never been 3 of us in the same place at the same time, let alone 4. That you can develop relationships, especially pre-social media, where because you're stuck in text and because you are stuck with time between communication, you end up reflecting more and going deeper than doing activities together. You're not going to a baseball game together. You're not watching a movie together. And so those filler pieces where we don't have to go very deep with many of our face-to-face friends, I think is different in an online environment, especially in old days when we were text-based, where I can write an email, we can do text chatting, but we have to have something to talk about, and that gets into some pretty deep conversations pretty quickly, when you don't have other touch points. So
Email in 1990. Wow.
right,
I don't
well,
know. Not easy to swipe right back then.
we didn't have web access when we got married, and so we found out, like, Deb had posted on a Usenet group and mentioned that she got married, and someone said, "Oh yeah, I saw the wedding pictures." And that was news to us because we didn't have web access, and somebody who was at our wedding had posted pictures from it, and this person in Australia saw the pictures and was commenting on it. I have no idea. I don't know that I ever saw those, but it was neat to be connected, and it's still neat to be connected. I mean, this is amazing stuff, right? When we start a conversation with the four of us and we can't agree on what day it is because we're at such diverse places, and we just don't even think about it anymore. And that ability to connect with other people, um, is astounding. It's still astounding. It's 30 years later and it's still astounding.
One of my
And
favorite things that I'd love to someday like just share with you guys. I think I've met literally hundreds of pages as our Skype text chat for I think it was pretty darn close to a decade. And so it takes us through birth of children and changing of jobs and going to school, and just even to be able to have that record is kind of interesting. And I do sometimes go back and go, when did I do this? Or when was, what were our conversations like? And I think that's
so
kind of
much
an interesting.
more searchable than a box of letters.
Exactly. But what's going to happen to it one day? When I lose my hard drive or whatever, I don't know.
I found myself thinking about the nature of shared experiences. And I think sometimes we frame it as like, in the past, we had this mass shared experience, the moon landing or the final episode of whatever TV show.
Final episode of
But
MASH.
I feel like that era was actually the anomaly, because we went from very small communities where it was your shared experiences were in the village to mass communication, broadening that. And now we're kind of heading back into lots of, sub communities that are, technology facilitated, but we've all had very meaningful experiences with our online communities.
And I would say also that those, like you say, the anomaly was something that I was not involved in, that I shared. So watching the moon landing or the last episode of MASH, I'm not actually in it.
It was
Only watching
it.
it.
A passive
Whereas
experience.
that community experience you were talking about from days gone by, and the ones that we've been part of here are ones that we actually were part of, right? We're part of the community. We're not on the outside looking in. So I really do think that, there's Walter Ong talks about a return to orality. And I really do feel that there's a potential there. We just don't have our literacy sort of lined up yet, where print, the idea of writing makes things stale and static, right? Like once it's written, it's done. Whereas this can be something that happens live. Like you can have this interaction. I mean, Jeff, you're probably the first person who talked to me about this, just the power of webcasting and what it can do to bring people together, and the idea of people being able to talk and across cultures. And we had tons of those experiences with EdTech where you do crazy connections between different groups that came together. And I think there is a difference between knowledge being chopped up into little tiny bits and thrown into a book, and being able to see the look on someone's face when they say it. I think those are different things, fundamentally different things. And there is definite potential. I just think it's hard to get there.
It was Jeff who said everybody should have a radio station. Like, everybody can do this. It's not everybody can be a publisher. Everybody can be a broadcaster. And yet here we are talking about the book, right? I mean, we could read the book. We could, everybody watching could read the book and probably have a more cohesively formulated and well articulated version of what we're talking about right now. And yet here we are, because that interaction around a topic and around a subject is more engaging than lots of words and not very many pictures.
And we just wanted to have a reunion, you know?
You just
Well,
wanted to-
Yes.
We missed each
Yeah,
other.
of course. Of course.
So we can have another hiatus soon, right?
Right.
You have to kind of
Well,
get back
you
at
know,
it to have a hiatus.
We're gonna do this
right?
week and we're gonna do next week, and then we're gonna wait for Jen's book.
That's right. It'll be my text chat. I'm just gonna print all the text chat from all
Yeah, don't
those
do
years. But you mentioned something to kind of take us in a slightly different direction. You mentioned as you were talking about this idea of boredom and the association between that and creativity. So, so certainly we all have. I'm sure some form of online addiction. So I go to bed every night and watch my TikToks, and would my time be better spent if I had something else that was more, I don't know, something else to not necessarily distract me from the realities of life. So what were your kind of thoughts on why you put that in the chapter?
John, I need to know what's on your face first. You get that confusing look on your face over there. You okay?
I'm fine. I'm fine. My mind was wandering just a second there. I was thinking about what Jen was saying and the idea that the content never ends. And so we keep scrolling forever because the page we never get to the bottom of the page.
Oh
Sure.
yeah.
And that compulsive addictive behavior I think is just as bad as that's probably one of the components of social media that is perhaps more harmful than many of the others, and that it never stops.
And I'd like to thank
Anyway,
Dave for improving
that's
my
what I was
sleep
thinking,
score
Dave.
last night. I have the bad habit of scrolling before bed, and it keeps me up too late, and often I don't drift off to sleep quickly. Whereas last night I was reading Dave's book, and I couldn't wait to get to the end of that chapter, and then I fell soundly
That
asleep.
That was
So
my
thank you,
question.
Dave.
Why is this chapter so
What?
long?
Nice.
Wow. I
Oh,
see. It's like that, is it?
yeah.
Um,
Wow.
Nothing personal, but I just there was a finish line,
Did,
and then I
did
could
you
go to
use
sleep.
AI to summarize the chapter so you didn't have to read the whole thing?
No, I actually read the whole thing.
I think that I think that's really, I think the fact that it doesn't have an end is really, I mean, I think most of us probably have a memory at least once staying up late and trying to finish a book, right? Where you go read it, read it, read it, read it, and don't want to put it down and read it. But eventually, if it's 2 nights or 3 nights or whatever it is, that there's going to be an end to it. And eventually you won't be able to keep reading that book. It's going to get put down. Whereas with this stuff, it just, there's no end. And weirdly, it gets better the more you do it. Because it gets further and further refined and it gets further and further tuned to what you're doing. And I think, you know, boredom's a really weird piece, and it's there are times I argue for it a little tongue in cheek just because it gets people, like, it sort of tosses them out of their sort of perspectives on things. But I really do believe that quiet time is effective, that it does good things for people, that it gives them a chance not just to be creative, whatever that means. And I'm not part of the cult of creativity who thinks that we all need to be great creators. We need to, go for better progress. But I think getting us that time to sort of think over the things that are important in our lives and sort of work through that stuff. And like I said, with my child, like, just prepare to go and talk to the doctor. Just all of those sort of interstitial pieces allow you to better socialize. And I'm not saying that kids don't socialize online, because I know they do. But the rules are different, right? And the rules are so intense. So, like, I was talking to a younger child last night, and she was like, I have a bunch of friends who don't like being left undelivered. Not on read. And for those of you who are not familiar with the distinction, on read means I looked at your message and decided not to respond. Undelivered means it arrived on my device, regardless of whether I picked it up or not. And there's an expectation that I should not leave you undelivered. Right. So even if I put my phone in another room, at some point in the 20 minutes, I should go check it, just in case you might have contacted me. Right. And that leaves you in a constant state of that kind of micro anxiety of knowing that there's something you're supposed to do. And suddenly your friendships become obligations. Right. Not necessarily bad obligations, not even obligations you don't want to fulfill, but it's a constant, like 24/7, you're supposed to be checking. You're supposed to
We're
check
back.
right before you go to bed and right when you wake up in the morning.
We're back to synchronous, right? Except that it's synchronous. That's always.
Yeah.
I've always hated telephones because the idea of calling someone is whatever I have to say to you is more important than anything you could possibly be doing right now. You need to stop your life and talk to me. And I've always hated that. And so the internet has helped me avoid that by I'll send you a text message and you'll respond to it when you respond to it, or email is the same way. When you get to that point where the expectation is that it's been like 7 minutes and Dave hasn't responded yet, that
Guys, a
we've
jerk.
lost something when we go there.
I think too, also like the distraction of it. Like I was just thinking about it. I'm like looking at I have a monitor that doesn't count, but I have a laptop, I have my phone, and I have my Apple Watch. So all three can give me my updates of my text messages. Let me know when an email came. So it's kind of hard to just have time, whether I'm bored or not, focused, get into a flow state or whatever when I'm working on something. When off on the side, I see a little green, message or whatever. And I don't know if that ties into what you're saying about boredom, but even just kind of this time where you're just allowed to focus and just to think about something that is not someone feeding you something that you should be addicted to watching and hitting next.
We were talking last week about the students who struggle with sculpture, right? To go over a length of time, and how professors at the university are finding that ability to stay in to the design work in some of the creative courses seems to be more of a struggle. And it's no wonder, right? It's no wonder. If you're constantly breaking out, like if you're constantly chopping up the work you do, those of us like me who write in short bursts, it's not as big a problem. I've always written in short bursts before and after the internet. It's like I'm probably amongst the least affected by this, because my attention is only so like I'm only so dialed in at any given time. But for the people who need that like focus, there's not a lot of chances to actually practice that culturally. And we certainly try to set up scenarios for our own kids in our own house where they actually have that chance.
That's what I was wondering about, how the parents in this conversation mediated the process of helping their kids learn to deal with this lack of boredom and endless stimuli and addiction culture, and how you modeled it.
We were doing better before COVID. COVID wrecked our approaches to that, because we're all stuck in the house like all the time.
And that's how you can connect with people, right?
Right. I think we've always struggled with the moderation piece and the quiet time piece. We were much better when the kids were smaller. I think we're lazier now. We're like watching videos more now, and there's a TV
and your
in
kids
the
are
house
adults
now.
pretty much, right?
Yeah. 20, they'll be 25 and 23 this summer.
Man,
so I know,
sorry,
it's crazy. There are activities in the house that are unplugged. Both of my kids were musicians growing up. There's music in the house all the time. Chord books are on paper on purpose, because you're not grabbing a device and following, like you get off the internet and play some music. I think when the kids were smaller, it was some restrictions on screen time, and we weren't crazy or militant about it, but it was certainly you're not taking a phone, especially smartphones once they were old enough to have them. You're not taking that up to your room at night, because you'll be on it all night. So making some limitations like that, keeping them in public places and in the house, and charging them on the first floor instead of the second floor helped. I think maybe our kids are less compulsive about their technology use than their parents are. Maybe that's because their parents are. I don't know.
I would love to have
I've
a
never
kid
smoked
episode
because my dad did.
an
My dad
epilogue
never
to this.
drank because his
Invite all
father
your
wasn't.
kids.
Yeah. Right.
I'll say that again, John. I didn't hear what you said, John.
I said I've never smoked because my dad was a chain smoker. He never drank because his father was an alcoholic. My kids stay off the internet because their parents, Dave's kids probably do the same thing.
1 and 1.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we've talked a little bit. I'm making a segue now to abundance of connections. We've talked about like our small little group, and even EdTech Talk is relatively small. But so how has it affected you as a group? This is a question to everybody, about having the ability to, I think I don't even know how many thousands of friends I have on LinkedIn and how many connections or whatever on Twitter. Like, what does that abundance mean in both a positive and a negative aspect? Any thoughts?
What's funny, the anthropologists will tell us you can have 150 friends. That's the sort of, I certainly have more people than that I care about, but I can't always remember who they are. Like if you ask me to list them right now, it'd be a struggle. But like,
Well,
well, let me
going
lay one
back to the
on
book,
you, but
you got in trouble in the book because
I
of the
did.
acknowledgments left
I
some
did.
people out, and
I
they
did.
were hurt by that.
well, I was going to say too, think back pre-Twitter when we all had a huge RSS feed of blogs we read. Very often you didn't know the person, but you knew the title of their blog or maybe
right.
what the page of the, the WordPress theme they used or whatever it might be. So if I had to answer my own question, to your point, Dave, there's no way I quote know 150 and I couldn't contact them. They'd think I was weird if I picked up the phone and tried to call them, the people that I would follow on their blogs, but I would regularly read, and they had profound impact on me. For example, people like, I'm just going to name some, like David Wiley and folks that, first started talking about open education and new things that have like fundamentally changed the way I view topics and where I put my interests and things like that. If I just stayed in my little town of Lodi, Wisconsin, I grew up in, I wouldn't have had any of these connections. And so from a positive standpoint, I don't even know how I would begin to even qualify what it's meant to me in my life, being able to have those connections.
I guess looking back on it now, I had arbitrary rules for different services. LinkedIn, my rule with LinkedIn was that I had to know the person in order to add them to LinkedIn. So, and typically those are professional contacts, and most of them are geographically pretty close, because if I haven't met them or haven't worked with them, I'm not adding them as a friend on LinkedIn. And that was just something I started when I started LinkedIn, and I've kind of stuck to that. So that number is much smaller for me. Facebook was always personal, and Twitter was always more or less professional. And I used Twitter as a way to curate content. And so differentiating between the people I learn from and the people who learn from me, and treating those as two different groups, was important to me, because I never felt that, just because I follow you because I find that the stuff you post is valuable to me, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should be following me. And so
Right.
in some cases there's a symbiotic relationship there. In other cases there never was. And so kind of as a result of that, I never really focused on who was following me. I was curating the stuff that showed up in my feedback when we had control over those things. And if I had something to share, I would share it. And if people found value in that, great. And if not, fine. I'm screaming into the vastness of the internet. But my need was more, I know this cool thing and I want to share it. And so I would share it, and it didn't matter as much who was reading that. My blog's like that. Nobody reads my blog,
I
right?
think
But
I
20
think you
years
just
later,
came
I'm
up.
still posting there because it's my need to share. It's not for an audience.
I think we have a new section for the next edition of your book. It's curating your connections. I think you just said something along the lines of that. And I think that's kind of the strategies I think I hear a lot of folks do, right? You curate based on kind of where you want to spend your time.
Well,
I see different
my
layers
current
of
frustration. Go ahead, Jeff.
I see different layers of connection. There's the people that I know from real life that I stay in better touch with. Last weekend was my 40th high school reunion. I don't know how those people got so old. And like I was able to sort of, not join remotely, but be part of that experience. Probably one of the biggest differences is the people that I do know in real life, I've been able to stay much more connected with because of social media, living afar. There is that world of like people I kind of know that I tune into, but then there's a much smaller core of actual online based connections like you guys that have impacted my life. But for me, that's a relatively small group.
So do you use LinkedIn, Jeff? Or do you ever?
Yes, I have many connections, and I go there to say, okay, I'll connect with you too, but I don't really tune in much.
Yeah. Any comments on that?
Oh, but the other thing is
Okay.
students. It has allowed me to stay connected with students, not all of them or the majority of them, but that's been a really nice thing, is to see my students' journey after they leave the classroom. And I have stayed in touch with some of them, and that has actually been a very nice, meaningful little slice of the pie.
Did you have anything on that, Dave? Before we move on. How
He
about
has
Twitter?
learned to say, I don't know, or I have
He
no
doesn't
opinion.
know.
Look at
He
that.
doesn't. How about Twitter? I think probably of all of us, you probably were the most active on Twitter. How is that? I don't want to say the demise because it's still going on, but how is the fundamental shift in Twitter? Not even called Twitter anymore. How has that
No,
impacted
I mean,
you?
that community is gone. So it's slintered out in a number of different directions, and I now find myself scattered across 17 different platforms trying to keep track of the people that I talk to centrally on Twitter. So I literally messaged somebody on LinkedIn the other day about a presentation they wanted to do for ShrugCon, and she said, I can't do the messaging here. Contact me on Signal. And I'm like, okay.
Right.
And so that makes I think it's the 8th platform I'm using to contact people in various ways about the conference.
So
Whereas
it's
two
like
years
EdTech
ago, I
Talk.
just would have done it on Twitter.
It's Jeff saying, "Hey, look at the new video conferencing app I found that we're going to break this week. Let's, and Jennifer signing up for stuff and realizing she already has an account."
Well, and I'm missing the responses back from them, right? So
Right.
I don't use Signal, so I didn't check, and she wrote back on Friday, and then I didn't see it. And it's just that whole community that grew together sort of just went off to the winds. And different groups have held together in different ways. But yeah, it's been a real disruption of my ability to get work done.
I think
Yeah, go ahead.
it's also harder to connect the tools together than it used to be. One of the cool things that I actually like about Facebook is the memories piece of Facebook. But
Mhm.
because I had Twitter and Facebook tied together, I get memories on my tweets because they were cross-posted to Facebook. Because the social media companies have started building silos, they're not as good at allowing you to share data between them. And so you can't set up a way for Signal messages to notify you on one of the 15 platforms that you're actually using every day. You have to individually check them all. And that's more fragmentation.
I have an EdTech Weekly type of question. Do you guys know anything about Noster?
Mm-mm.
It's supposedly one app to rule them all. But
So what does it aggregate that everything or
it's a simple protocol for decentralizing social media.
oh.
Okay.
But we'll save that for the EdTech Weekly.
Yeah, I was going to kind of get in the
I don't
weeds
know
on
that
like
social media
Mastodon and
wants to
stuff.
be decentralized.
What I will say is that LinkedIn has solved some of the later problems that we had on Twitter. So from 2014, 2015, things started to go in terms of tone and just people's approach to things. And doing work in the last year, say, way more work on LinkedIn than I've ever done before. Having it tied to people's professional um, home bases really
They're
does
not
change the
anonymous
tone of
anymore.
people. It
Yeah.
really does change. Not even just the not anonymous. So there are people who are not anonymous whose names I knew who were aggressive on Twitter who had never considered doing it on LinkedIn.
Hmm.
Just because it traces back to their jobs because they figured nobody was watching when it was Twitter, right? So it does mean that the tone of the conversations is much better overall. They're a little stiffer,
I was going to say plastic is what just like comes to mind. It's just very
but less so, I think, in the last. There are large sections of the education community that's moved over to Twitter, and it's
there's no
having an
place.
impact.
There's
It's
no
getting a
place to
little
go.
bit looser. It's getting a little bit more flexible, a little less plastic. But
So why do you think Mastodon didn't take off? Or is it just too hard? The learning, I mean, even though it's not huge, but even the learning curve to like find people and
Yeah, it's kind of it was the bounce back boyfriend, right? Like it was a rebound boyfriend. I think that probably hurt it as well. Everybody was like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna go there." And,
Yeah, it
like
just
do it
seems
for a
like
couple
it
weeks.
should be, because you kind of get to choose your own adventure to some extent, or choose like where you put yourself.
Which nobody wants, right?
It
Like,
turns out
Right.
people don't,
Right.
right? Like it sounds like it's
well,
a great thing, but
that's why Twitter was for however you believe in the mythology of how Twitter was started. That's what's so brilliant about it. Like John said earlier, like you don't even have to know the person you're following. All you have to do is click follow and then type in the box that's there and hit go. And there's nothing else you need to do. Right. And so the barrier to entry is so low. And the barrier to return is so low that it makes it really easy to interact.
I'm learning
And I
all sorts
find
of
that
things about Dave from his LinkedIn page. I had no idea that he had a fish culture license.
I do. I do. I should really take that off of there.
why? Why? It's about you.
Oh no, it was me testing the micro credential system.
Oh,
How has fish culture been affected by social media?
Well, they school around a little more. I don't know. I don't know. There was a joke there somewhere, but I
there
never found
was.
it.
Mm,
But this actually is, I think let me see if I can try to bring this back together because there's a section of this chapter where you talk about, and I think especially now from what we're talking about as a segue of like, we had this one mass community and now we're finding all these different places,
Yep.
like kind of the good and the bad and actually in some respects frightening aspects of some of our conversations now being so focused and with a small group of all saying and thinking the same thing. And what are the implications of that?
Was that a question?
That's just a
Uh,
statement, sort
it's
of, and
terrifying.
you
The
could take it as a
implications are
question.
terrifying. Like if you look at how quickly somebody can get radicalized right now and the ways that their communities insulate, it's astonishing. Um, and again, I think that sneaking ahead to the next chapter here, um, the idea that there's one answer and that someone's going to give it to me is the thing that I think influences the way a lot of these communities work. So people go looking for answers, they find someone who's willing to give it to them, and then they accept it. And that as long as everybody inside of there agrees, it starts to becomes more and more true the longer they talk about it, right?
At the
And
same time, isn't Mr. Bridges? How many bridges did you have?
a lot of bridges.
200 bridges. Those were all.
Yeah.
That was the idea there, right? That everybody would have like a niche thing to kind of.
That there'd be a space for all different types of conversations. Yeah.
So what is what's like, how did we go from like, yeah, let's have a knitting group to let's
But that was very values
overthrow the
based. They
government?
were World Bridges community, and I spent time thinking about what are the norms and what
Yeah.
kinds of conversations, and would not hesitate to say, nope, that's not World Bridgey. And the community decides what's World Bridgey or not.
Yeah.
And some platforms do that more than others. It seems to be the lack of the clarity of the values and the norms that create a lot of the problems.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the fact that
Yeah.
we just don't know how to talk about values. Right? Like I think that that's one of the biggest issues, chapter 6. Is that
This doesn't have to be linear. We can talk about them.
no, but we're not accustomed to doing it. So one of the things I really valued and I actually again learned from you, Jeff, is how to talk about values in a community overtly. So I remember trying to figure out why Fark.com worked. Is one of those first things that I tried to figure out about communities online. Because an extraordinarily successful community that seemed to have like hundreds of little unwritten rules that were sort of vaguely policed, but after a while you could see there's actually a very overt policing that's happening. And it all came from, I think the guy's name is Drew, and he set people in charge of moderating, and he gave them very specific guidelines to work from. I don't necessarily agree with those guidelines,
mhm.
but it's that sort of overt statement of this is who we are. Is something that, again, going back to what Jeff was talking about earlier, those communities from long ago, we didn't have to have that conversation. If there's 150 of us living in a village somewhere in northern Alberta, we don't have to renegotiate what we are as a community every year. Like you just don't need to. You habit and you've
You,
inherited it.
you establish your norms over time, and then people either conform to that or they get ostracized.
And therefore,
And they get tweaked
nobody,
along the way.
yeah,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
on a like long scale,
Yeah.
right? And so the vast majority of people are not involved in that tweaking. There may be some leadership things, there may be like a flood that happened and changes people's perspectives on things or whatever. But everyday people are policing existing values, not talking about the ones they have and how they're different from somebody else. And as we multiculturally, here in Canada, we call it, but as we come together across cultures and my values are different than your values, um, that starts to get there's a lot of friction there, right? Between those sort of comparative values. Um, I was telling stories the other day about being in Korea and having this guy who ran a hotel, a Yogwan, Hagwon, no Yogwan, that I was living in. It's a hotel that I was living in. Slapped me in the head probably 5 times in the span of one night because I kept doing things wrong. So I would like drink before him, or I would like there's a series of rules that I was definitely doing wrong. And he was quite cheerful about it. Like he wasn't being mean or whatever else. A totally normal process of smacking the head.
Just spanking the puppy.
Um, right. And he
Mhm.
was being really sweet about it actually, but I was getting smacked in the head. Um, and he was trying to explain to me what the what the rules, what the values were, and how I was supposed to be respecting him and how that was supposed to work. And it's not like I lack a respect for humans, but there's a very specific way of doing it that we all culturally understand inside of our own sort of spaces. But one of the advantages for me having gone abroad is I got a chance to get smacked in the head enough to maybe knock me out of my own space a little bit.
So you recognize that different communities have different rules, and they're not all the same rules as New Brunswick.
But almost the whole time I was in Korea, that lovely old man is one of the very, very few people who ever tried to explain it to me.
Yeah.
And I was super privileged to have met him very early on because he explained a lot of things that people just expect me to know. And it's that sort of willingness to explain your values. I mean, you can ease up on the smack in the head, but explain your values is something that a lot of people just aren't in the habit of doing. And he had been uh teen, I think, during the Korean War. And he'd had some experience around in that city in Korea. There's more experience with the American military, more experience across cultures. And he'd worked with the American military and had that sort of, I'm going to explain this to you so that you understand what's happening sort of practice.
When I
Um,
think about the common values of most of our social media platforms and certainly our media and some part of our educational world, the most common value is maximizing shareholder value.
Mhm.
So like if we're expecting Facebook or Twitter, any of them to like say, okay, we're going to take the high ground here. It's all about maximizing engagement and profit.
Right, right.
I think that also is why like Mastodon is so decentralized and there is no Elon Musk running Mastodon. So I think Jeff, I'm kind of making a connection to something you used to say too. Like there needs to be at some level on some of these like a benevolent dictator that is and to your point, like some as far
Well, and
was it a profit motive that's keeping someone interested in being engaged to be that benevolent, or maybe just plain dictator, not a benevolent one? But does that help to keep large scale communities going to that profit motive? Because if it's not there, it just becomes too decentralized. I don't know. It's a thought. It's not a question, but you can answer if you'd like. Take a swing at it. Like, do you think that's a
certainly
bad
the
thing or a
profit
good thing?
motive, certainly the profit motive is the one that's the easiest to understand, and the easiest one to maintain over time. So like I remember we were in Delhi 2012 and the government was working with local edupreneurs trying to reach out MOOC wise into some of the less developed parts of the country. And their argument was that if we have a purely profit motive, they're just going to sell it and move on. And if we have a purely like social outreach motive, then that will just get caught up in government bureaucracy. And so they wanted to try to blend the two together I don't know that we have effective models for that either. It didn't work there. That's not to say it's not possible, but it's such a subtle piece, right? Like, how do you consistently go back to your board and say, well, I know it's going to cost us money and this probably won't work, but let's go and take this chance to go and help those people over there. That's what governments are for, ostensibly. It's tough.
Dave, what about Wikipedia and the norms there?
Ooh. I think Wikipedia has wrecked more communities than any other thing that's happened on the internet. I think more people have tried to copy their model, and I don't think it's a real model. I think they got extraordinarily lucky. And anytime we look at it as a way of doing things, we're hoping for something that's never going to happen again.
Convince me
Jeff's,
that that was luck.
Jeff's giving a look.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
They
why?
never even intended to do it,
Okay, but like they have a system, it's working. Why is it so hard to
but
replicate?
they fell into the system. Like they didn't develop that system. That was the one they just like it was like, well, you do it. And it just kind of evolved that way. But it evolved because it had never been done and there was a real need for that thing.
But doesn't it
And
work because there's someone who's willing to pay the bills and keep the lights on without becoming a billionaire?
A benevolent dictator.
Like Jeff,
Someone or some group.
like Jeff.
I think that there are many other people who are willing to do that, who have tried to go down the Wikipedia road of having a large community of people support something that large and have failed because trying to keep people's focus on one thing, like creating something that is that huge and so that identity bound, I don't even think you can do it on the internet now. Like I think the time of building those things is done because it is so huge
They
and
were
so
kind of the first, one of the first major
It-
players in that space. And so like there's not
yeah.
going to be a major
So first
Wikipedia
out,
And
competitor.
it didn't have to be huge when they created it. They could grow it.
well, they got
And
lucky with the
now,
software there too.
yeah, but now you can't create something and get enough traction because it's just, overwhelmed by all the giant things that are already there.
Yeah.
Which is sort of, I can maybe try my hand here at a segue. In
Please
chapter chapter 6, this idea of authority and uncertainty. Because I know certainly using the Wikipedia example, if I have a question, I very often will go to Wikipedia and at least point me in the right direction of where, some thoughts on that topic or whatever. And Dave, you mentioned the pandemic today and other times we've been here, but how does this all tie in with the issues of abundance, uncertainty, and then authority, and where we get our how we how we treat? I'm thinking Fauci was in front of Congress this past week for his efforts during the pandemic and how those efforts are perceived.
They're being
these
terrible
days.
to that poor man. So I'll try not to be too boring, but I am sorry, Jeff, this will not be under a minute.
Okay,
Um,
I'll settle in.
so you see an increasing history inside, particularly in the United States, coming out of the American Air Force and the Rand Corporation towards problem-based, problem-solving approaches. And so increasingly through our sort of thoughts about education as we try to be more evidence-based, we move towards this idea of things being measurable in a way that we can actually verify and seeing things that are measurable and verifiable as better than those things that are ephemeral and judgment-based. Because you look at No Child Left Behind as a perfect example, right? So you've got the extreme testing model that you send out so that you're trying to raise test scores, which again is an artifice that you're trying to raise, not happiness or learning, but test scores, right? And so that whole problem solving, right answer, test building sort of has an impact on a culture is the argument that I'm making. And the idea somehow is that every problem that you're given as a student has an answer, and that answer is something the teacher already knows. So fundamentally, the game of school is I have a problem, you give me a problem, I do the thing I'm supposed to do, and I hand back the answer to you. So the argument I'm making is twofold. One, wicked problems or real life problems aren't solvable in that way, right? So when somebody tells me what I should be doing for climate change, it's like, I can't solve the climate crisis. And no one can solve the climate crisis because even defining the climate crisis, as soon as you try to define it, you leave something out, right? Same as when you talk about poverty in a city or any of those kinds of big problems that we have in our cultures. Defining them is changes them even in the process of doing that. And what you see people wanting to do inside of schools is to come up with scenarios that allow you to sort of lockstep your way through a process, right? So that I can know whether or not you've gotten it right. And the argument that I'm making is that instills in you the belief that you can get things right. And the story that I tell in the book is about one of my students who told me that I was asking his opinion. He didn't believe me because no adult had ever asked him a question without already knowing the answer, right? Like that idea that there is an answer becomes ingrained in the idea of what it means to learn. So if somebody is giving you an answer, you're more likely to believe them. Whereas if somebody goes, well, it kind of depends, you think they know less about the issue, right? So if somebody responds to you with nuance, it's actually worse. So I just got this book in the mail a couple days ago. She does a really great job of talking about how this works in medicine. So, um, doctors, when they first go into hospitals, think that when they have a patient who they can't figure out the answer to, they figure it's something they don't know, rather than that there isn't an answer to the problem that's wrong with the patient. And so it turns back on them all the time. So one of her responses to teaching medical students to be more prepared for uncertainty is what they call gray cases. And they're cases without answers that you need to engage with and process your way through. That preparation for uncertainty allows maybe people to hear people with the right answers, maybe, and trust them a little bit less and trust the nuance a little bit more. Right. And for me, that's the big distinction. If I'm going to enter into a values conversation with you, the thing that we're talking about has to be uncertain. So if we're trying to decide what's the best way to facilitate an important community conversation, if there's only one answer, there's no need for us to have a values conversation. There's no space for it. One of us is right, whichever one is louder, probably. Whereas if we accept that it's possible for multiple perspectives inside of a given issue, not you can have a perspective that's different from mine until I convince you otherwise, but actually contain multiple perspectives, then we can have difficult discussions with each other without just fighting our way through it. But the argument here is that our education system has locked us into this idea that problems have answers. So that when we're talking, we're not trying to figure out your perspective and see how that blends together and sort of whatever. We're just trying to figure out which one of us is right.
And this may not even be a function of abundance of information, which is maybe where we're at in society. I don't know. But you were saying like the student didn't like, well, I don't know if they didn't like, they were taken aback that you didn't come from a position of, I have the answer that you need to tell me back. But I think we're kind of seeing that across the board with all experts and with all traditional bodies of authority or expertise. Is there's such a lack of trust, and maybe that a lot of that has come out of the pandemic. We remember in 2 weeks we were supposed to flatten the curve, and then we'd all get back to life as normal. When that didn't happen, then it's like, and I don't believe anything you're telling me from here on out.
I think about the pandemic, and it was a time of uncertainty where we wanted answers.
We wanted answers, and if they weren't, right answers,
right, and the answers
the
that came out
then
sometimes were not long-term correct, or they were a little like the not wearing masks. When the pandemic happened, they said, oh, don't worry, you don't need to wear. Like 3 billion people in Asia went, huh? Wear a mask.
And you told us about that at the time because we met early in the pandemic, and Jeff kind of gently said, yeah, your government is lying to you because they're telling you things that you are willing to hear.
And because they were trying to save them for the medical workers, which
if we don't have enough masks, so you don't need to wear them. Plus, you're not allowed to leave your house anyway. So, like, let's not create panic and hoarding. And also, if we told everybody they had to wear masks for the next 3 years, they would reject the whole thing and just say it's a hopeless cause.
Yeah, but I do think this, shift from relying on these authoritative sources to, as you were saying before, Dave, we've got these splintered communities, and then you have like different thought leaders in all the communities, and then things can kind of go off in different directions. So one of the questions I had for the group, and Dave, I don't know if I didn't see this spoken about directly, is there any positive to the fact that we do have all these splintered communities, and those communities can also go viral with counter programming or, fact checking? Like, is there a role for that as well? We certainly have Snopes or things like that, but
I
is
think
that
it
a
is.
positive?
I think it's interesting you went to fact checking because
Mm.
again, I think there are lots of things that are facts and are right or wrong, but I don't think those are the ones that get us into the most trouble. I think the ones that get us into the most trouble are things like the effectiveness of wearing masks. It's a great example. Are masks 100% effective? No. What would that even mean? Of course not. But statistically overall, and then there's a whole bunch of other nuance that you have to explain to say why it's better to wear them than not. And the simple fact is that we'd all be healthier if we wore them all the time. But no one wants to say that. So then you're kind of stuck in this. And then somebody says, well, shall I wear them or not? Because they want an answer. Right. And so I think from a fact perspective, we're in much better shape than we used to be. Right. I think that you follow the SIFT method or whatever else. If you're using the internet to any degree, you can get your way around whether or not it's something. If something is actually true or false, and you're actually willing to find it, you can actually find it. It's anything in between that's the problem, right? So
And
then it's
values
like,
come into play here also. I can tell you about 20% of my students usually wear masks. Some of them are sick, some didn't do their makeup. There's no shame, there's no value judgment here about
yeah,
it. And I don't think that's happening in other places.
no, one in a
No.
Not
hundred,
happening in the US.
1 in 100 here, maybe a little more, a little less, maybe 1 in 2.
Oh, you can go to a hospital and see zero. Or there are lots of sick people that should be protecting themselves and potentially protecting others. And it's not in
No.
Chicago.
So
And
I
I
think
think
that there's
Go
great
ahead.
value, just to answer Jen's question. I think there's great value in particularly when we're talking about voices from the margins, like when people get a chance to talk about their cultural perspective on things. Um, Again, I just don't think we're ready to hear it because that we need the humility to not be convinced that our perspective is right just because it's ours. We need to know how to trust, how to deal with those things, and we need to be able to discuss with our values. We don't have those taught to us as part of how you learn. We're taught backwards. We're taught facts first and nuance later. And to me, it should be the other way around. That we should be taught the nuance first and the facts later. Right? So we should be learning with that nuance so that when we get confronted with anything new from a different community who says, I want to dance in this way, and we're like, you know what, I really appreciate that, but it's just not my kind of dancing. Is fine. It's a great response. It's not wrong dancing, but it's not it's that sort of that transition. Um, but we're taught to just call it wrong dancing.
And I was listening to an interesting podcast this week, Plain English by Derek Thompson. And it was talking about how the fake facts, the shocking information, we're predisposed to be interested in that, and the media amplifies it, and all the algorithms amplify it, but then we don't get the follow-up or the nuance. They were giving the example of infant mortality increasing, which is sort of a fact that most of us have, oh yeah, infant mortality is actually increasing in America and everything. Turns out it's actually a factor of how it's being measured. But I had not heard that until I heard this podcast. And there's all the bad news, the shipping clog, the supply system is messed up, but you don't hear but now it's working fine. Like you hear the shocking bad news, the trauma, the whatever, but you don't hear the rest of the story.
My favorite example of that is during World War One, the UK Army switched from leather helmets to steel helmets, and their casualty rates went up. And the reason that their casualty rates went up is because their mortality rates went down. So they had more people wounded who were living and therefore were casualties, and fewer people just dying on the battlefield. but unless you're right, unless you actually looked at the nuance there, you would conclude that switching to steel helmets was a bad idea.
And the flip side of this is also just as dangerous, right? So then you get to the point where everything you hear, you're like, whoa, I want to see the research on it.
Mhm.
Right.
And that's also problematic.
Trusted
because-
sources. What's one of your 3 pillars?
Yeah, that's trusted sources. Yeah, that's number 2. Yeah, you got to be able to broaden that out to a community, which is why I need somebody who knows more about solar panels. I found one, by the way.
Mhm.
I found somebody. He's an
person.
electrician who actually has solar panels. So I finally found somebody with the expertise to answer my questions.
Cool.
Yeah. But that's
Joe
required.
GPT.
Somebody who actually has enough of the pieces to be able to sift through all the business. Right?
Yay, human
And you-
intelligence.
And you tried to contact him, but his internet's out because he doesn't have power.
No, he was at
Yeah.
he's in my backyard drinking beer. Or I just found him there.
But what are
As
his
you do.
motives? Is he trying to
As
sell
you
you
do.
solar panels, Dave? Will
I
be-
think he might partially be trying to convince himself that it was a good idea.
Oh, no.
He's trying to get beer out of Dave.
That's always a struggle.
Yeah.
Well, we had a big, this was a big ask tonight, 2 chapters in 1 hour. I'm knowing this things. Is there anything, Dave, that you wanted to make sure we pay attention to as we're reading through these 2 chapters? Did we
No,
cover?
I really, it's a real pleasure, a real privilege to have this conversation this way. So I want to thank you guys. But it is real great. When I wrote this book, I was hoping that it would spur, like, John was talking about earlier, there's something about the focus in the long form that allows you to have other conversations you might not have had otherwise. This is exactly the kind of conversation I was hoping I'd get to have. So.
And now that we're almost at the end of the book, I'd like to start a new section of our show called Favorite Lines. I have 2 favorite lines, one from each chapter, and in both cases from the last paragraph. You have a fine last paragraph game, Dave.
All right.
You know, you give us all sorts of blah, 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 and then this last paragraph is always kind of, from chapter 5, I've done too much project management to believe in conspiracies. Totally get that.
Yeah. I just, every time people talk about it, I'm like, who do you think is organizing this? Like,
so they faked going to the moon, and they had all these people involved, and nobody's
Nobody's that organized. No.
And from chapter 6, and this hopefully leads us into answers next week. Next week we get answers to all these problems. If you've been getting stressed and concerned like me, got to tune in next week. We need to be the best curriculum we can be.
yeah, John.
The community is the curriculum. Dave's been saying that for 20 years. Oh, yeah, it's right on the cover of the book. Forgot about that.
Well, thanks, guys.
He could have put
Thank you,
that,
this
the
was
community is
fun.
the curriculum, and then he wouldn't have to put Dave Cormier at the bottom because everybody would know, oh, that's Dave's book.
All right, so next week, the grand finale, chapter 7.
The conclusion.
What is the title of chapter 7?
Now what? So what?
Big physically is your book. I'm reading a Kindle, and I never get like the conception of like
It's
Practices for an Abundant World.
Practice, okay.
it's practices.
Practices.
That's what I was
practices.
very surprised that there was a chapter on.
Jen, it's
And, there is
remarkably
hope.
small.
Yeah, let me hold it up once. Can you hold it up, Dave? You got it.
Can you show her the spine
the hard copy?
so she can see how thick it is?
Oh, that's pretty thick. It's hard to tell in a Kindle format.
And that's a hardback or a softback?
Oh, soft.
Soft.
Hard.
Paper.
Hardback.
Hard, okay.
That's
And,
that
you know,
is hard. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
they're all hardcover.
Oh, are they?
there is hope for humanity. This is finals week, and my students have been answering all sorts of questions. And one of their opinion essay topics was, ebooks are better than hard copies, or hard copies are better than ebooks? And several of them went with hard copies. And they also had the option of creating a business proposal to or writing a grant to the Lebo Foundation. And one of them wrote for an unplugged cafe. When they went in, they had to leave all their devices outside. So
Oh.
they're still out.
Made entirely out of tin.
And the
So tune in
essays
next week for
written,
answers
Ed.
when we will conclude our discussion of learning in a time of abundance. See you then.
Ta-da.
Okay.
You know, we never got to
Love
your
it.
thing, Dave, about your thing you did today, your